English has been borrowing from other languages as long as there has been English. And during the early modern period, we should say, so roughly 1500 to 1700, there are some distinctive currents in the borrowing. One that I don't have any slides to show you about is the borrowing from Latin. As you know, Latin is always there for English. Late in the early modern English period, it begins to fade out of fashion, and as those old philosophical and religious discussions move from the world of Latin into the discourse of English, they bring with them some of the vocabulary out of Latin that are useful in them. Lots of philosophical terms, things like anima for your soul and so forth, and so animated. And this is true of science as well. But what this video is really about is the way England, through a process of or many processes of political and economic change, began to become a player on the world stage and bring with it some vocabulary that traces the changing material culture of England. That is, the stuff that England is encountering as it reaches its tentacles around the world, and comes with names, and those things get borrowed at the same time. We will see English vocabulary drawing from nearby Europe, from farther afield in the Old World, and eventually from the New World during this period. The Renaissance, as you know, so-called Renaissance, as you know, is well underway by 1500, and ground zero for this is Italy, especially northwestern Italy, around Florence, which is the reason that so much of our artistic vocabulary, since French, is Italian in origin. When we talk about an orchestra, and when we talk about the words for things in an orchestra, like violin and cello and so forth, we're using Italian words. That's because the musical fashions changed and began to radiate out of Italy and carry with them Italian terminology. This is true of concerto. This is true of symphony, which is a Greek word brought into Italian and then spread over spread over Europe. And as you know, if you're a musician, all of the jargon of how you perform music, things like crescendo and decrescendo and andante and so forth, they're all Italian words for this reason. The modern musical trends stem out of Italy, or the early modern musical trends stem out of Renaissance Italy. Opera is one of those trends, and this has to do with a resurgent interest in drama, another one of those words. And again, drama is a Greek word brought into the Latin world and then into Italian, and then spread by Italian around Europe. That little creature with the funny red suit at the bottom is a pantaloon. This is a stock character out of Renaissance drama in Italy, and Pantaleon is a stereotypical name for old men in Venice, and it becomes the name of a stock character in Italian comedy, this dirty old man from Venice named Pantaleon. That stock character crosses Europe with the trends of drama and becomes Pantaloon, a kind of buffoonish, clownish old man. This is of particular interest in the history of English because, along with these changes in drama fashion and in artistic performance, came changes in wardrobe and in clothing fashion. And it happens that in the 1500s, young men in England began wearing not breeches, but pants like this, and they got called pantaloons after the character who stereotypically dressed that way. In a word, a pantaloon means clown pants in early modern English, but it caught on and it became the ordinary word for pants and for trousers, and only in America has it been shortened to mean pants and then made, the regular word for this garment on the lower half of our bodies. Interestingly, the word was narrowed differently in England, and pants, as you know, means underwear in England. We have a similar word here in English, too. Speaking of pants, you'll notice that all of these European youth, I think they're in Venice, they might actually be in Genoa, are wearing pants, and their pants are jeans. So trade was burgeoning across Europe during this time, too, and So certain kinds of fabrics began to be traded from place to place. The production of textiles used to be kind of a cottage industry, and then it became a regional industry. But then, as Mediterranean trade picked up, Egyptian cotton became important in Europe. Egyptian cotton came into Europe through Mediterranean ports like Genoa and the city of Nîmes in southern France. The cotton cloth made in Genoa was Genoa fustian, or in early modern English, jean fustian, and it gives us the word jeans. Jeans are named after the fabric made in Jean or Genoa. That's what we call a toponym, a word that's named after a place. Anyone who's interested in textiles knows that we usually say jeans, in English anyway, are made out of denim, and that's another toponym. Another important cotton fabric during this period was the serge de Nîmes. It was the fabric that was being made, that came from Nîmes, France, that is de Nîmes, that is denim, another toponym. You can see that this toponymy, this practice of making names, naming stuff according to where it comes from, involves a certain kind of metaphorical transference. You can work that out philosophically if you wish. But notice that our changing vocabulary carries a record of changes in material culture and changes in commerce and international trade and relationships from this early modern period. Beer's another thing that began to be traded internationally during this time. There was an Old English word beor for fermented beverages, but it probably had to do with fruit beverages, not really with fermented grain. That was ale. It happens, though, that the continental Germans, particularly the Dutch, they kind of dropped the word ale and stuck with the word beer in their languages. But something very important happened in the later Middle Ages and early modern era. People had flavored fermented grain drinks with all kinds of stuff, whatever they had handy, including lactic fermentation that just makes it kind of sour. But the stuff didn't last very long. You really had to make it at home, drink it at home, or make it here in town and drink it here in town until the early modern era, when people in the Low Countries and northern Germany began to flavor beer with hops. Hops have antibacterial properties that prevent the stuff from spoiling. They preserve it. They also give modern beer its characteristically bitter and aromatic flavor, that citrusy note that decent beer has. What this meant was suddenly Dutch beer was a saleable good that you could put in a barrel and ship overseas to England and sell. And so the word beer, which had all but died out of English, came back in as a borrowing from Dutch during this period, thanks to changes in brewing technology, and again in a way that reflects the growth of international commerce in early modern Europe. And that goes along with some changes in technology, including food technology here. There are a lot of other words coming into English from Dutch during this time. One of the most important ones that lives on now is actually the F-bomb, probably a borrowing from Dutch during this period. In fact, certainly a borrowing from Dutch during this period. England at this time was becoming a more impressive military power. This is the age of exploration and the age of empires, as you know. The early superpowers here were Spain and Portugal, and then the Netherlands as they began to catch up. In 1588, Queen Elizabeth I, whom you see here, allowed one of her commanders to do her the favor of sinking the entire Spanish Armada. We see that dramatized back over her shoulders here. Notice that she has her hand on top of a globe. Very subtle symbolism here about what happens when you sink the greatest navy in the world. It leaves you having the greatest navy in the world. And from 1588 on, the reach of England continues to grow. This is the beginning of the British Empire, really. And, of course, and that happens at home, too. The successor to Elizabeth I here is James I. Well, he's King of Scotland and King of England, so in fact, they're united by one crown. And in 1707, legally, they become united under a single crown. So there's consolidating power on the British Isles, and there is power now being extended around the world. And this power supports commerce, trade networks, and conquest. It brings goodies from farther away. England becomes an important presence in the Mediterranean. You can do that once you beat Spain, the keeper of the Straits of Gibraltar, at sea. And we began to see words appearing in English that reflect this. We have a tulip there, that is the Tulipa armena, the Armenian wild tulip, native to the Caucasus. Its name comes from a Persian word, durban, for a turban, because that's kind of what it looks like at a certain stage in its growth. So now we have Persian vocabulary coming into Europe and coming into English through more extensive networks of old world trade. These words don't have to be filtered through a Mediterranean port anymore. We get yogurt during this period, both the thing and the name. Every culture with a dairy tradition has its own names for tasty forms of spoiled milk, and yogurt's a particular version of that. Coffee is another one. This bean is native to Northeast Africa and perhaps Arabia, and it had spread through the Middle East by this period, and it is brought to Europe by 1600, and gains a terrible reputation as fomenting political insurrection, all kinds of stuff. Read about the controversies over coffee houses. So while this economic exchange is going on, there are other kinds of cultural interchange. It's not till around this period that English speakers really start taking an interest in what the Muslim world has been up to. Back during the Crusades, you find the most crude stereotypes in the literature. Assertions that Muslims are worshiping Apollo and stuff. They're simply an adversary, and they're really a distant adversary in the medieval English imagination. But by the 1600s, the Ottoman Empire is a political reality whom they face to face, and there's a great concern about how cultural interaction with these religiously and culturally different people ought to work. It's not till the 1600s the first translation of the Quran comes into English, and leading up to that and around that period, there's a lot of vocabulary that has to do with accurate representations of the Muslim world, including terms like mosque, and we have the Blue Mosque in Istanbul here, and mullah and so forth. At the same time, there's an interest in this part of the world as exotic, and there's a lot of appropriation going on. So the term harem comes in, along with lots of fun exotic ideas about what people might be up to in harems that aren't entirely accurate, of course. And you can read about this particular kind of appropriation, Orientalism, if you want, in the works of Edward Said in the book by that name, Orientalism, which is an introduction to it. The terms sultan come in during this period, turban, and all sorts of things, fez. What we're looking at here is a glass of Turkish tea, as it's traditionally served there. And tea's not native to Turkish, so through various routes, though, trade with Far Eastern Asia is becoming nearer and nearer to England. There have always been overland routes. Since Roman times, silk was reaching Europe from China through long trade routes that extended overland and around the coast of South Asia. But by the early modern period, all these countries are extending their trade routes, and tea from the Far East is making its way to the Middle East overland, and also making its way into Europe, partly overland through the Mediterranean then, and partly directly as the Portuguese first and then the Dutch reach all the way around to Southeast Asia and to China, in fact, to establish direct trade relationships. This leads to a really interesting bifurcation in our vocabulary. Many of you know the Indian word chai for tea. Well, that's also the Mandarin word cha, and it's also the main word for tea all over Eastern Europe and the Middle East. These are people who got tea overland along with its Mandarin or Cantonese name. The term cha or chai also was the first word for this drink in Western Europe because the Portuguese got all the way to southern China and first bought this stuff and learned about it in Cantonese, where the word is cha, and they brought back the term cha. But very quickly, the Dutch East Indies Company went and kicked Portuguese butt all over the South China Sea, conquered their trading posts in Malaysia and in what was then Formosa. Of course, now it's Taiwan, where a different word is used. This word is te, and the word te came to Western Europe thanks to the Dutch East Indies Company, and that's the modern English word. If you've been studying the Great Vowel Shift, you can tell that T, that is te, must have reached English quite early in this period because it shows the shifted vowel T. And it does, in fact. By 1600, it is in the English language. Cha has been displaced by T. There's also trade and conquest going on in the New World, and of course the first wave of that is Spanish, and so the first wave of vocabulary that comes back to Europe is filtered through Spanish. The Spanish conquistadors encounter Taino Indians all over the islands of the, it's not the Mediterranean, of the Caribbean, and they bring back their words for things like canoe and barbecue, barbacoa, which was a drying rack for meat or fish originally. Also, maíz, or what in English maize, the word for this New World grain, which Americans call corn. The same goes for potatoes. The batata in Spanish comes from the Caribbean, the Taino word for what we call a sweet potato. And further on in their explorations and conquests, the Spanish conquistadors got to Peru and they found people growing a different root crop and using a different word for it, and they call it papa. That's the thing that we call a potato in English. There's been a transference of the original word. In English, we call the papa, the regular spud that we make French fries out of. We call that the wrong word. We call it the Taino word for sweet potato, batata. But these are all vocabulary that come into English via Spanish in their first contact with these areas and their first conquests in these areas. We get some other words like tomato and avocado the same way. Those are Mexican words, that is, particularly their Aztec words, Nahuatl words, filtered through Spanish. The alligator is an interesting case. There were crocodiles in the Mediterranean, of course, since prehistoric times, but when Spanish speakers got to the Mediterranean and to Florida and places like that, they met this really big honking lizard, and it was so big they didn't call it a lizard, they called it the lizard in Spanish. And the lizard in Spanish is el lagarto, which by the time it makes it into English, probably through French and Dutch, becomes alligator. There's an interesting borrowing there, but it's not a borrowing from a Native American word, alligator. English speakers followed soon after. By the 1500s, late 1500s, English speakers were trying to settle the east coast of America. And by 1607, of course, the Jamestown colony was established. And by 1620, the Massachusetts Bay colony was established, the famous Pilgrims. And so from this point on, there are direct borrowings of Native American words into the English language. And these tend to have to do with plants and animals and places. That is to say, this is a typical superstratum substratum situation. Very quickly, English speakers displace the Native Americans, but keep their words for the new stuff that they didn't already have a word for. We have a possum here. We have Massachusetts. We have on the map there. You still have Delaware and other places that are named in Ohio. Other places that are named. I hesitate to say by Native Americans because, of course, they didn't name states, but named that borrow place names from Native Americans who had lived there, and pecans, hickories, persimmons, all kinds of things that don't exist back in the old world. Chipmunks, and all kinds of other words for such critters. Moose is a very important one. Moose only comes into the English language during this period, as a borrowing from Algonquin. And as you know, it's far too late for moose to follow that old pattern that goose and geese did. So moose is stuck being one moose, two moose. Geese has been in the language long enough that it's an ancient word that went through the old vowel changing plural process to make goose geese centuries and centuries prior. So we can sum the patterns of early modern English borrowing up this way. Of course, there's a wave of Latin borrowing into early modern English, and that's actually the largest wave. But when we talk about borrowing that reflects new changes in material culture and in political and in the political and social fabric of the lives of English speakers, now we're talking about English borrowing through trade and cultural interaction in Europe, out through the Old World, and even into the New World. And it reflects different processes. There's trade at work here. There is cultural exchange going on here. There's cultural appropriation going on here. And yes, there is displacement there, particularly when we talk about Native American vocabulary that finds its way into the modern English language especially during the early modern period.